It's my pleasure to go ahead and introduce the true all-star lineup, your presenters and panelists. First, we have Tom Winter, who's a senior IT executive at Gardner Denver. We're proud to call Tom a customer of ours here at Campango. Tom has 20 plus years global experience working in a variety of industries, everything from utilities to manufacturing, and really very deep expertise in a number of areas from strategic planning to cloud-based solutions, and then really, of course, business process engineering. He is going to be sharing with all of you today some proven methodologies for business process management, sharing examples of what some of those methodologies look like, and really, I think, provide either a starting point for those of you who are looking to implement new business processes, or some very actionable items that you can take away and I think start implementing in your own businesses. We also have John Sapir, the founder and CEO of Silvertree Systems and Work-Relay. John is a good friend of Campango's and we work closely together. He has years of experience in the software industry, also vast knowledge of business process management. He's a published author several times over, and his publications really focus on the very things we're talking about today, like process, projects, and project management, just to name a few. So welcome to both Tom and John, and a big thank you for joining us and presenting today. And then lastly, we have Ted Evangelakis, who's the Vice President of Product Services at Work-Relay. Ted brings with him 20 plus years of internet application and development experience. He has spent and really built a career supporting businesses who are transforming to cloud-based systems. So honestly, between these three gentlemen on the line here today, there's a breadth and a depth of knowledge that we really want you to tap into. And because of that, we encourage participation during the webinar. So feel free to enter any sort of questions into the chat and the Q&A section that you can see. Otherwise, we are going to be leaving time at the end for Q&A as well. We want to make sure that all of you get as much value as you can out of the webinar. A couple other housekeeping items. We are recording the webinar. And so after the webinar session today, over the next few days, you will start seeing some emails from Jared Tunn, who is an associate channel manager here at Campango, and he's going to provide that recording to you, and also just some other valuable resources about business process management, as well as Work-Relay. If at any point there are things that you are very interested in, that you hear about on the call today, feel free to shoot Jared a message directly, and we will respond in a very timely manner. All right, so let's jump right in, right? What we want to do before I turn it over to Tom is just really to kind of level set a little bit about why we're here today, and ultimately kind of go through some of the struggles that we hear from a lot of clients that we work with, and John and Tom feel the same, right? So oftentimes we hear that, as people are looking at their current operations, they tell us that their processes are consistently changing, and that's either because of regulations or market demands, and having processes and then systems that are agile enough to meet those changing demands is often something that we hear people struggle with. We also hear that people say, hey, we have a lot of processes in place, or we're using certain technologies, but things still are not working very efficiently. We don't know where the breakdowns are happening. We need to get time to market faster, right? And so there's some problem with our current process where it's too prolonged and we need to shorten that. Employees aren't understanding, what's going on in processes or visibility, or myself as a manager, I'm not able to actually report up to leadership what's going on, and that's a problem. And so these are true pain points, right? And the types of things that we're often hearing when we enter into true solution-based conversations around business process management, what those methodologies look like, and then, what technology can be used to help solve those. So, ultimately we know that those are the challenges, and here's kind of the end state that people are hoping to get to, and why either implementing a new business process management system or software or solution is something that people are, and including probably many of you on the line, entertaining, right? We want to increase productivity. We need visibility into what's going on in our processes, in our projects. If you're especially in a highly regulated industry, right, business process management is a way to ensure that you're remaining compliant and reducing risk. Business process management and the systems that support it also heavily impact the worker experience, what's happening inside the four walls of an organization, which ultimately translates into an impact on customer experience. And of course, people want things that are repeatable, sustainable, agile, and ultimately things that we can measure the efficacy of. So that's the desired end state, but here's kind of the state of the union, that there are hurdles and challenges to actually implementing these things effectively. One, the conversation moves well beyond technology, and that's something actually both Tom and John are going to talk about here, that there's more decision makers, more stakeholders, that this is a true kind of business need discussion, not just adding some sort of software platform to your tech stack. A hurdle or challenge we often hear is that there's a lack of exec buy-in, right? Many of the stakeholders who are probably on the line here have to somehow justify changes in processes that can sometimes be painful and require investment. There's lack of user buy-in. Anytime processes change and technology is added, that there can be resistance to that. And then ultimately the technology platforms that are out there, many times we hear people saying, either our homegrown system or what we're using, or obviously if you're using manual processes, that's just not agile enough anymore to meet, constant changing demands. So we see this disconnect between what people want and then the real state of the union. And so what we want to do here next is turn it over to our experts on the line. And Tom's going to talk through the benefits of various workflows, but also give some very actionable and proven methodologies. And I think that these are things that can help provide a starting point if that's where you're at on the line, either for the first time in the conversation or you're looking to really transform what you're doing. And again, also provide actionable insights. And then Tom is gonna turn it over to John, who's gonna talk about, one, where technology solutions fit into this, how they can actually support these types of methodologies, and also, provide some very specific customer successes in ways that other clients that they have implemented these things effectively. So Tom, why don't I go ahead and turn it over to you. I do want to note, sorry, this is just an admin note, that I'm having a difficult time turning over and sharing control. So I'll just go ahead and control from here and just move through the slides for everybody.
All right, thanks, Kathleen. Can you hear me okay?
We can, yes.
Excellent. So thanks to Canpango for asking me to talk about workflow. I'm just going to dive into two main areas based on experiences that I've had around benefits and methodology. So if we go to the next slide, depending on your role in the organization, either you have a process that is inefficient, whether it's too many steps, too many people, you're just not getting the results that you have, or you're going to someone with that type of request. The first questions that really come up are always around the benefits of this. And it's usually an initial conversation that comes up around, and there's always a push in companies now is, are we seeing hard dollar savings come out of this? And the initial discussion tends to be, well, there's going to be efficiency savings. We can reduce some steps. We'll get some efficiencies out of there. We're not really taking people out of the process. And so often that's where these discussions stall right out of the bat is, we only want to invest in things where there's a hard dollar return. We know there's efficiencies, but we're not going to get rid of any individuals because of this. And I just really want to focus on that that's the wrong approach, because often when you have these conversations, it might be nothing more than a hallway conversation on what you want to do. People have a general understanding when somebody talks about a process, but until you really start digging into a little bit, I think there's often misconceptions in the business world that we're talking about the same things with a process. So if we go to the next slide, I want to dive into that a little bit more. So Before you dive into your discussion on benefits, and Kathleen was talking about other problems like executive buy-in, others buying into what you're trying to accomplish here. It's always around this benefits issue because people are thin in their organizations right now with people. Yes, they want process improvements, but they don't want to lose any people out of it. So you get into this discussion and it just kind of sits there. So what I'd recommend is really take a process approach before you have that conversation and define your current state. The hardest issue that I see with most process discussions is where does it start and where does it end? And that can require a lot of discussions because people might know a HR process, what the general steps are within that, but where do we want to start our process? Where do we want to end our process? And as you get into the project, that discussion may change along the way. You need to look at the roles involved, and it seems like when you start these discussions, you're usually talking about individual names of people, you're talking about titles, and it really takes a little bit more digging to understand that person's role specific to that process. What does that individual do in that process? Are they a data collector? Are they an approver? Do they do some type of analysis? And it's important to look at things from a true role perspective. You map out that process, and with so many of our process, there's so much technology involved. What systems are we interfacing with, or maybe do we want to interface with in the future? That's certainly where we can see some efficiencies. So when you look at that, assign your full-time equivalent employees or non-employees that are involved in that process. Include supervision, what span of controls are working within that, and then look at what is the true cycle time. Is something taking 5 days? Is it taking 4 days? Get that current process mapped out. So then where do we want to go with it? And here's where you get into, I think, the true analysis. And again, these steps are often not done at the right time for the project justification. So when we look at the future process of where we want to go to, we want to take out those non-value added steps that are there. So that's fairly straightforward. This first bullet there becomes often more of a political discussion when you get into approvals. Why do people need to approve things? Is there a true reason for it? Do you even fall under some financial controls that somebody needs to do things, or is it just the way it's always been? Those are types of things you want to go in and challenge. When you've mapped out your current state and you look at the future state, maybe you have an individual or a role which touches things in step 3, step 7, step 9. To make that process more efficient, can you group what that individual does? So when the unit of work comes to them in one stop, they're able to add all of the value that they contribute in their specific role and move it on. That's something that takes a little time, a little thinking about, but when somebody has a touch, can they do everything they need to do without having that unit of work bounce around back and forth? This next bullet seems really straightforward, but I've found it to be one of the biggest flaws when we say figure out what roles do. When we talk about so many traditional business process roles, we think that we have a clerical person in a role, and we really underestimate what that clerical person does. We say, well, they take information off of a sheet of paper and enter it into a system. Where I've seen so many automated workflows fall flat is they really didn't understand the value add that clerical person may have done. Maybe they were editing the data that was incorrect on the form. Maybe they were able to make logical ties to this information that it should be associated to other information within a system. There's a lot of experience that a role like that may have, but you really need to understand what they do in great detail. So if you are automating things in a fashion that you can tie things together correctly, because again, that's where you can have failures where they think individuals are just inputting information. Another one is, when you look at true process-based organizations and workflows and processes within companies, especially nowadays, we have so much movement and flexibility in our processes where we're working with people outside the company. Are you truly taking that into account? I think a lot of process projects fail because they're just looking at what happens within their walls. But are there contractors? Are there other parties that we outsource to? How can we bring them in so they truly are just another step in the workflow versus that's someone on the outside? You also see that when I talked about start and stop points. Often when we get to the walls of our organizations, that's when we think processes stop. But we can maximize those processes, make them broader and be more effective if we look beyond our walls. Also, there may be a lot of processes that have been laid out sequentially. And when you look at them, there's not dependencies within a lot of the stops in the process. So are there things that we can take and run in a parallel mode? When those parallel processes are completed, then the unit of work can move on. And that can contribute to a great cycle time savings if we look at things in those regard. Look at our system interfaces. There's certainly a lot of non-value added rekeying that happens that we can take apart. And then as I mentioned earlier, we may be adjusting our start and stop points. Now with our new process design, if we look at the FTEs, look at what we're reducing from a cycle time situation, now we can come forward and build a true cost benefit because we have a very well-defined current state, a well-defined future state. We can point to the gaps. We should be able to specifically show where those savings are. So as opposed to the conjecture in a hallway conversation, now we have facts and data that we can build our case on. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about methodologies. I was fortunate many years ago to work with some folks who came out of MIT who were big into this process design, and those individuals are folks who could talk to these things for hours and hours, and that would put you all asleep. So I'm just going to touch on these just for a little bit and talk about the value that I see in one of them specifically. The first one is a data-centric model. So if we go to the next slide, you would think about this model as what's commonly used by IT professionals to show data movement within processes and systems. So data flow diagrams, if you're an IT professional, you're very familiar with those. They're excellent at structuring data, but they show weaknesses in coordination. And that's a lot of what we're trying to show in our workflow process. If we look at the next one, which is more role-centric, sometimes you'll see this articulated in block diagrams. As far as this individual does this, this, and this. It's very intuitive in its approach. It shows the coordination of what individuals do, but you can be limited as far as the rigidity of the workflow when workflows become complex. But often the one that's used, but it's not my preferred method of working with one. If we move to the next one, this is very event-centric. An example there is bank processing. It goes this event, this event, this event, this event. It struggles with some things around roles and coordination, but it does have good value in certain specific processes. The next slide is the one I want to focus on and talk about a little bit is more of a work or a state-centric model. And what you do with this particular approach is your wait state is where you're waiting for a role to take an action or to do an event to move it to the next state. And with a focus on these wait states, you really focus on reducing cycle time and how long is a unit of work sitting in a state before someone takes action on it, and how can we get that action to move more quickly. So on the next slide, we'll just show a real basic example of something very simple, but just to talk about that idea. So we have in this example, a marketing representative submits an outline. And the wait state, again, is we're waiting for the brochure design to happen. Then we have another role of a graphic artist designs the brochure. We're waiting for the brochure to print, and then the graphic processor prints this. But the focus of this type of workflow is on those wait states. Why are we waiting so long for the brochure design? Why are we waiting so long for printing? And when we're looking at our total cycle time, we need to look at the individual components within a process. We focus on why things wait so long, and we can easily timestamp that from when a unit of work comes in to that wait state and when it transitions out. So just a quick summary here. This is an example from a utility I worked with many years ago. It was became a utility best practice IBM success story when it was completed. And it was focused on the utility's new construction process, taking a process that originally had around 40 steps and getting it back down to 6 or 7 primary steps as far as what was being looked at. And a number of the things that I've talked about, we can illustrate in here. The initial slide here is in the service application taking process. So if you're building a house, you need to request gas service. We had multiple contacts that took place with different people in a marketing representative role, a call center role, and we talked about combining work that those individuals done. They were involved in the various processes. We got to the point where all the specific needed information from the customer, from our asset inventory, was combined into one step. We go to the next slide. Now we took out a number of processes that had been running together. So Kathleen, if you move to the next one. And we made these parallel processes. So, and depending on the situation, there was engineering work that needed to be done. There was permitting that needed to be done with a municipality or another government entity. Legal easements that could be required. We may need to receive a down payment from the customer. We may need to extend the main over towards the property. So a lateral could be run into the house or into the building. These were all processes in the past that were handled more sequentially in nature. There was no reason that had to happen, so they were run in parallel until they were all completed. When all of those parallel processes were completed, then we looked at actually doing the construction and inspection. So on the next slide, we kind of illustrate and talk to that. And all of this work was done by parties on the outside. So we talked about the boundary walls of things. We're breaking down the boundary wall. We're including our construction contractors into our business workflow, bringing them in, mandating that for them to do work with us, they have to follow and use the technology in the process. So we've expanded our process to include that. And then what we had as the last phase was also talked about in some of the prior slides about building interfaces to various systems. So customer systems, asset management systems, materials systems. As this broad workflow process was built, it gathered a lot of information. There was no reason for that data to be rekeyed. Looking at all the analysis of what various clerks did throughout the process and making sure we captured the data intelligently up front with the proper edit checks so it all could be loaded automatically into business systems. So that's just a couple of things that I wanted to talk to today in regard to methodologies and business cases. So I'll turn it back to Kathleen.
Great, thank you, Tom, so much. Like I said, I think that those are some great examples, some very actionable insights, and then obviously leveraging, your years of experience to see really what's worked and quite frankly, what maybe hasn't worked. So what we want to do now is turn it over to John, who's going to talk about, again, where and how technology can fit into this solution-oriented conversation and also share some customer successes and really kind of bring things full circle. So, John, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Hey, everybody. So I want to pick up where Tom left off. And, you know, we talked about cycle times, and he talked about things like, creating steps, merging steps, having parallel sequences, and so on to reduce the cycle time. But one of the things that is often not considered is the things that cause the wait time, at a nitty-gritty level, the things that cause the wait time as the process moves through and across the organization. So I want to focus on those and talk about ways that you can significantly reduce the cycle time of your processes in really relatively simple ways. So things like, making sure nothing falls through the cracks, obvious one. Make sure everything's ready to go before a task starts. Increase the smarts of the person. Make sure that they have everything they need. And the last one is to be able to keep an eye on what exactly is going on so that action can be taken faster if it needs to be. So let's start out with this one. This is the obvious one. Make sure nothing falls through the cracks. And a little image here illustrates that. You can have the best athletes in the world, but if you drop the baton in the relay race, you're not going to win. It's the same thing with business. You could have the best people in the world, but if something drops through the cracks, it really doesn't matter how good those people are. So the way that you can address this is very simply through having automated notifications so people are notified when they need to do something, reminders that are maybe recurring, that happen over a period of time, and a whole bunch of escalation rules that you can make sure that someone is taking action and there's not this wait because nobody's actually working on what you think they're working on. So one of the companies that we worked with, this was a critical issue because they had, for every vendor that applied to work with the company, there were like 10 or 15 documents that had to be approved. And approvals, there were 15 approvals. So 15 different people had to approve it across the globe. And you can imagine that a lot of opportunity here for things falling through the cracks. And so what we implemented was, the reminders, the escalation rules, things like, and also things like exception handling. How do we improve the exception handling so that, we don't have to wait for someone to come along and approve something or make a decision, things like that. So that was something that was very applicable in that particular case. The next one is to make sure that everything is ready to go when the step begins. So if you look at this diagram, in the top part, before the person started the task, they had everything that they needed to complete the task at all those various points where the inputs are required. If you don't have that, then you get into the situation where you have to gather various things, whether they're reports or files, whatever it happens to be, while you're doing the task. So if you can get everything set up ahead of time, you're much better off and actually going to focus on the job and getting it done. And the way we implement this is basically we have preconditions and postconditions. So preconditions are basically what has to be true before this step can start. And this could be many different things. It could be previous steps that have to be completed. It could be some files have to be uploaded. Lots of different things that you don't want the person to start working on the step until these things are in place. And coming out the other side, sorry, go back, Kathleen. Coming out the other side is kind of, making sure that when someone says that the task is actually done, that it really is done. So here you can put in, some business rules saying, you can't say that this task is complete until you fill out this form or add this this file to the system. So where this came in very handy was in a custom manufacturing environment, where what happened was that people would have to wait around for decisions to have to be made. They had to do rework because all the work wasn't ready before they started. Lots of those kinds of things. And we implemented the pre and post condition setup where we had, before anything took place, you had all these rules. When someone said that they were finished, we made sure that it really was finished. And checklists were a big part of this. So we often think of checklists as just like, to-do list kind of thing, but checklists can be very powerful if you include in the checklist things like, you have to say that this thing is done before you can move on. And it's very helpful from an audit point of view, because you can always go back and say, hey, you said this thing was done, but because you checked it off on the checklist, and it's not. So, a lot of different ways of doing that. The third one is to increase the smarts of the person responsible for the step. So, okay, so now the person who's responsible starts up the task, and they run into problems. They don't have the right instructions. They don't know the context. They need to collaborate. So what we call smart steps are where people have all the information they need to complete the task at their fingertips. So it could be anything from instructions, like the most up-to-date instructions on how this task is done, experts, who should I contact if I have a problem, the audit trail, like what happened before, what decisions were made before, what are the open issues, what checklists do I need to fill out, what are the risks. So there's many different things that you can include. And all of this is designed to make it very simple for the person responsible for the task to get it done. So the way the system works is that when you are notified to start up a task, you have a link that takes you to all of these things. So you have the full amount of information that's available related to that step. And things like collaboration, for example, with Chatter, all take place within the context of that step. So anybody who is involved in the collaboration has all this information available to them as well. So this was very important with a company that does drug trials for pharmaceutical companies. And here, the projects go for years, very long projects. Regulations change as time goes on. Different ways have to be implemented. All sorts of different things happen. So having all of that kind of information set up in the task as a kind of knowledge on demand, it was very, very helpful in getting things completed much faster. The last one is kind of a general one where you basically, you want to know what's going on at all times without having to wait for someone to report status, any of those kinds of things. So one of the dashboards that we have, you can see in here, each row is basically a process, and the columns are steps in the process. And this is obviously, all the instances of this process that happen to be running at this particular point in time. And you can see at a glance, what's going on in terms of each of the instances, and then you can kind of drill down to see what the problem is. And this is real helpful to getting problems solved much faster than if you're waiting around for for someone to find the problem and actually deal with it. Last thing I want to say here is that just kind of bringing the whole thing together. One of the issues you have with business process management systems is that they typically tackle one part of the spectrum of processes. So Tom had mentioned various types of processes, and in many instances, a company will buy a BPM system to deal with automated flow-centric type situations, and maybe an adaptive case management tool to work on decision-centric and ad hoc type of situations. We looked at that and we said that that doesn't make any sense, because oftentimes an end-to-end process in an enterprise actually consists of all these different, multiple of these different types of processes. So in our product, everything can be done in one place, regardless of what type of flow it is. Okay, I'm going to turn it back to Kathleen. Just the last thing here, we're the only enterprise level BPM system out there that is 100% native to Salesforce. Kathleen.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much. John, we did have a couple of questions come in. I want to, since we're sitting on this slide, could you address why it matters that Work-Relay is 100% native to Salesforce, just in a kind of high level, concise way?
Yeah, sure. So what happens, what most companies have right now is they've gone ahead, they've implemented Salesforce, so they have this great platform and they've invested a lot of money in the platform, but they also have some BPM system that they're using, Lombardi or any of those kinds of things. By moving over to Salesforce, you basically really simplify your work environment. Now there's only one system, all the data is in one place, the people the users are maintained in one place, you get rid of all the licensing and all that kind of stuff. So if you've implemented Salesforce, then you want to leverage your investment, this is a great way to do that.
Great, thank you. There was also a question that was sent directly to Jared during the presentation, asking about like Work-Relay services in terms of, it looks like the person's asking around like designing and implementing the software, and then how Work-Relay and Canpango are working together. So could you just briefly address that as well?
Sure. So one of the things that's really great about the product is that you can learn it very quickly. It's kind of like Excel, where you only really use 20% of the product as a kind of all the time kind of thing, but that other 80%, you might want a piece of that 80%, just here and there. So we provide different types of services. We get you up and running on the 20% really fast, and then you can either decide to implement your own processes in the system, or you can work with us. We can work together, or we can come in and do all of it, right from the beginning to the end. So there's all sorts of different options, and every company is different. But what we've typically found is that once the first one or two processes have been implemented, people are self-sufficient and they can kind of go off, and then only when they come across something unique that they haven't seen before, we can provide the support to help them through that, so they don't have to know everything about the system.
All right, great, thank you. Just a couple other things. It looks like we did have someone ask if there's going to be a recording available. The answer is yes. And then two other questions here. This is a great question. So Tom had talked about the work state model, and ultimately how you can start seeing why certain tasks are taking longer, or why there are those wait times and those lag times. Can you provide either with the case studies that you just talked about, or some other case studies, how Work-Relay addresses that in the work state or the wait state model, or how you've seen other customers basically be able to have more visibility into things?
Yeah, so I think that the key here is to be aware that something's in a wait state, and that if something is waiting for something, then you need to know about it as fast as possible and take action. So part of the way to get through that is through the whole remind and notification type thing, and the dashboards to kind of make sure that everybody knows what's going on at all times. And I think that those types of that type of functionality in the product really helps decrease the cycle time and make sure that, you know, there's no tasks that are kind of held up waiting for something that nobody knows about. So yeah, so you know, Work-Relays, I mean, that's one of the biggest advantages, that we make sure that you can accelerate the way in which work moves across the enterprise, and that's a critical part of it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. All right. So it looks like we were able to address some of those questions that came in directly to Jared and some that came privately to me. If there are any other questions that anybody has, anything of interest here, either from, you know, the methodologies that Tom shared, Work-Relay specifically, please feel free to reach directly out to Jared, and we'll get you to the right product expert or industry expert to speak to, and his phone number and email are there. So again, just a really big thank you to Tom and John for presenting, Ted for being a panelist here, just in case some of those more technical questions came up. And all of you who joined us, we know, it's end of month, that can be a busy time for people, and so we appreciate you taking the time to join us. Please look for some communications starting tomorrow and then over the next week of this recording and some other additional information. So we'll go ahead and sign off. Thank you again to everybody, and have a great Wednesday.